anyone born between the years this and this probably knows Kid Cudi is the guy who made a song that was in a Mountain Dew commercial in 2013. If you work at GQ. Otherwise, there's a good chance that he saved your life at one point.
Why you like Kid Cudi so much?
You saved my life.
Kid Cudi, man. Kid Cudi's like really like one of the main dudes I kind of like looked at and listened to all the time. He saved my life.
This dude right here literally saved my life. I was gonna end my life one night in high school, and this dude literally saved my life.
You saved my life. My name's Jacob. I love you. I love you too, Jacob. Make some noise for Jacob.
He was one of the first artists who began independently on the internet that successfully catapulted into a mainstream icon. Right from the start of his career, it was clear that he brought something new to the table, not only because of tracks on his MySpace page and his debut mixtape A Kid Named Cudi, but also because of his contributions to Kanye's 808s and Heartbreak, to which the 4 best songs all have a writing credit from him. He had a real knack for melody that played off of an eclectic and futuristic production style that was a real breath of fresh air for the time. What he lacked in vocal range, he more than made up for with compelling songwriting and hooks that'll never leave your head. Not to mention his iconic humming that basically made anybody else who ever hummed in their music sound like they were ripping him off. Another big part of what made him resonate with so many people was his willingness to speak on things like
depression and anxiety,
which was very uncommon for a mainstream pop rap artist at the time. Hell, I don't think resonate is a strong enough word.
He saved my life.
Now, to be perfectly honest, my personal connection with Kid Cudi isn't as deep as a lot of other people's, as I didn't really grow up listening to him when I was going through tough times. He's someone who I've grown to appreciate more retrospectively for his impact on music and pop culture as a whole, as he's undeniably influenced a great deal of the modern musical landscape. Even though the sounds and aesthetics of the genre have changed a lot since the late 2000s, I think his debut album, Man on the Moon, still stands as a timeless classic that's far more than just, oh, this guy rapped about being sad and the people who listened to it were sad too, and that's why it's a good album, because he's sad. This thing is an absolute masterpiece from a production standpoint, pulling from alternative, psychedelic, and electronic music, and putting them together into a seamless and one-of-a-kind package. Nearly every song is built around a simple, earwormy melody that gets thoroughly explored in the most extravagant way imaginable, whether it be through oddball sample choices or synths that sound like part of a big sci-fi movie. The instrumental palette is pretty broad, resulting in a wide array of genres, from the alien disco banger Intergalactic, the alt-rock infused Alive, and the bittersweet psych pop of Pursuit of Happiness, which to this day I think is the greatest thing that MGMT has ever been involved in. Cudi's verses are melodic and tend to riff off of the main tune within the hook, yet they're all written and delivered in a somewhat stream of consciousness way that makes them sound like carefully calculated ramblings. It's like you're sitting down and having a conversation with him while watching the cosmos explode in the distance, sounding like a big budget production that's still a down-to-earth and uncompromised vision. Sure, some of the lyrics can maybe come across as a bit too sappy, and the whole multiple acts thing feels a little underdeveloped and kind of hurts the pacing more than it helps it for me, but it's easy to overlook those things when every song presents such a refreshing idea from the last, and they're pretty much all executed beautifully. Except for Make Her Say. I don't really like that one. The Lady Gaga sample sounds like it was remixed to fit in a Macy's commercial, and this might be the worst Common verse I've ever heard. Regardless though, Man on the Moon is one of the greatest pop albums of the 2000s, and established Kid Cudi as a truly one-of-a-kind artist who would never make a universally hated rock album. His follow-up, Man on the Moon 2, continued to have cool production, with sounds ranging from the large orchestral Don't Play This Song, the reverb-heavy sampling on Mojo So Dope, and the unsettling art pop of Maniac. Yet I think this album falls short of its predecessor, mostly because the hooks aren't as memorable. It seems to put more emphasis on smoothing out the rap flows and building an atmosphere than it does constructing a strong melody at the core of each song, even though I think Man on the Moon 1 did that perfectly without sacrificing atmosphere. But it was still cool to hear him continue to experiment with his diverse range of influences, especially on the lead singles Erase Me and Mr. Rager, that both dabble in indie rockisms in a really refreshing way. In fact, just a couple years later, he formed a full-on rock band with his producer friend Dot the Genius called Wizard, whose lone album had pretty underwhelming reception, both critically and commercially. Looking back at it though, I think it's pretty decent. Considering alternative rock has been such a prominent influence on Cudi's music thus far, it feels natural to hear his voice on top of these guitar-centric instrumentals, especially on cuts like The Dream Time Machine, Teleport to Me, and Upper Room, that still carry a lot of the same genre fusions that were on his first couple of albums. His songwriting style translates pretty tastefully most of the time, and there's a few good riffs here and there, but the one thing that really holds this album back for me is the production. production. Nearly every song is mixed in an understated way that prevents them from being as vociferously hard rock and grunge punk alt metal industrial fortismo as the duo probably wanted them to, and even softer songs like Afflictum and the cover of Where Did You Sleep Last Night are still kind of hindered by this. I think they showed a lot of potential with this album that could have been expanded upon had they continued the project, but after the poor reception, Cudi just went back to the drawing board and tried new things on his next solo album, Indica, which also wasn't received all that well. Despite Indica largely pulling from the same pool of genres that the first two Man on the Moon albums did, they aren't really fused together in a seamless way so much as they are a messy Frankenstein of hip-hop, alt-rock, and electronic music. While I do admire this record for being so bold, I never really find myself wanting to return to it. In fact, the parts that I remember most fondly are the guest features, like the sampled Father John Misty hook on Young Lady, the Kendrick Lamar verse on Solo Dolo Part 2, and Red Eye, which is basically just a Haim song with Kid Cudi backing vocals, but a pretty solid one nonetheless, despite how much it clashes with the flow of the album. The guest features being my favorite part actually isn't that surprising, considering he described this record as his Chronic 2001 due to the abundance of collaborations and his own contributions being somewhat scattered, though he still has a writing credit on every song. After this, he shifted even further from hip-hop with his ambient psych rock focused Satellite Flight, which felt like the next logical step forward for his sounds, though I find most of it kind of boring. I like the cinematic yet melodic string sections on the title track, the glitchy drones on Copernicus Landing, and how the wintry electronics progress on Too Bad I Have to Destroy You Now, but Cudi's lyrics and vocal performances are kind of meandering and don't breathe as much life into these instrumentals as I know he's capable of. Not enough humming out of 10. Although I am happy that he's consistently gone the route of changing up his shtick from album to album rather than making the same thing over and over again. It was around this time when Cudi had relapsed into his struggles with substance abuse, feeling like a fraud for struggling with mental illness while constantly being in the spotlight.
People look up to me, but I'm not a happy person. So a lot of the times I felt like a fraud, and that's what drove me to the dark side of what I was dealing with.
In 2015, he was at the darkest point mentally that he'd ever been since starting his music career, resulting in his follow-up album, Speedin' Bullet to Heaven, being uncompromisingly raw, personal, and difficult to listen to, for various reasons. As a result, it failed commercially and was pretty much universally panned by both fans and critics upon release.
I'm feeling a 0 on this record. A big, fat goose egg.
Oh my God. No, I can't do it anymore. I can't do it. This is the end of the fucking reaction video. I'm coming to my final verdict right now. I don't even need to listen to the rest of this shit.
It's hard to find any interviews from him around this time. He canceled a tour a few days before the album's release. And even in his Amazon documentary, he doesn't really want to talk about it.
I don't know if I want to talk about Confused, because that was like a really dark time for me. I don't want to talk about any song from Speedin' Bullet.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
In the following years, he's gone on record stating that the album was a cry for help, and that it was the only way that he could express what he was feeling at the time. Thankfully, he seems to be in a better place now mentally, as he was able to get the help that he needed shortly after the album came out, and subsequent projects like Kids See Ghosts and Man on the Moon 3 are more optimistic, while still being introspective and emotional. While Speedin' Bullet to Heaven is generally considered to be his worst album by much of his fan base, it's grown somewhat of a cult following over time for how unflinchingly real it is. It's also been praised by other legendary artists like Andre 3K, Erykah Badu, and A$AP Rocky.
I mean, my favorite Kid Cudi album is a Speedin' Bullet to Heaven. It's crazy.
I think this record deserves to be remembered as more than just a weird misstep in Cudi's catalog, as it carries just as clear of an identity and artistic vision as any of his other albums, even if it sounds kind of amateurish and slapped together. Musically, it's another shot at making a full-blown alternative rock album, yet it's completely different from what he was doing on Wizard. Whereas that album clearly tried to have commercial appeal with its radio-friendly hooks and expensive production, Speedin' Bullet to Heaven doesn't seem to be concerned with appealing to anybody. I saw someone on Rate Your Music describe this album as this generation's Neandra, which if you're unfamiliar with, is a collection of weird home-recorded songs by Red Hot Chili Peppers guitarist John Frusciante at a time when he was addicted to heroin. In fact, he released another album a few years later, consisting entirely of songs that he didn't plan on releasing at all, but ultimately did because he needed more drug money. I don't usually like to oversimplify album descriptions as this generation's blank, but I actually find this comparison to be pretty apt, as both show artists who've had commercial commercial success in the past that they really weren't ready for, making music that's main purpose is to be therapeutic for themselves. As a result, you kind of question whether or not you're even supposed to be listening to it in the first place, despite being officially released on a label. One thing that I think really cements this is the inclusion of a second disc that consists entirely of previously unreleased jams, demos, rehearsal sessions, outtakes, and more! I don't really factor this in when talking about the album because 1, it's mostly unfinished bonus content, and 2, well... The entire tone of the album is set up in the first track, Edge of the Earth, which consists of a simple acoustic guitar riff and barely discernible vocals that work with the lo-fi production to sound completely defeated. This part of the song basically functions as a suicide note, with the overall muddy sound symbolizing the complete emptiness he feels on Earth. On the second part, Postmortem Boredom, the vocals become cleaner and the guitar gets plugged in, as Cudi is now dead and in the afterlife, yet the sound is still empty as he's unsatisfied with what he sees up there.
The angels have no whiskey. Can't say I'm not disappointed.
This terrifying and heart-wrenching thought is communicated in the music scarily well, with how these two parts are able to symbolize different planes of existence, while maintaining the same sense of bleakness throughout. We then get the lead single Confused, which is one of the few songs that actually goes by a conventional structure. It blends grunge instrumentation with Cudi's signature backup crooning in a way that I think works really well. The verses go in depth about his issues with self-harm and suicidal thoughts, between hooks and bridges that relate to the title of the song, feeling confused about his own identity and the ones around him, and how he doesn't want to do drugs all the time but does anyway, and how he can't help but feel suicidal despite how much he wants to live. His head is full of contradictions that make him feel disconnected from the world around him, which makes it more fitting that this happens to be arguably the catchiest track on the album, sounding upbeat and sticking in the listener's head when the lyrics are bleak and hard to stomach, illustrating the inescapable cycle of shame. Man in the Night is another grunge-influenced track where Cudi's vocals are more unhinged than the previous two tracks, as now it's nighttime, which every Cudi fan knows is when the lonely stoner frees his mind. The whole thing sounds like one big hook, as the instrumentation doesn't really change that much throughout the track, though the riff is pretty solid. Oh yeah, I gotta talk about these. So at the end of a handful of tracks here, there are sketches where Beavis and Butthead come out to comment on the music that you just listened to, and they're actually voiced by Mike Judge. Even people who like this album tend to agree that these sketches are pretty annoying, and yeah, I skip them every time they come on. You could definitely make an artistic case for them being here, as the album was heavily inspired by music played on MTV in the 90s, which is where these two characters came from, and given how this album is Cudi trying to communicate his emotions through the lens of entertainment that he finds solace in, it makes sense that he would imagine these characters commenting on his music. Hell, there's a few times where they don't even like the song that he just played, which actually plays into the themes of self-hatred pretty powerfully, stating that he can't even fantasize about succeeding. Also, considering the artistic decisions of this album were very much drug-induced, it makes sense that he would think about cartoon characters he grew up watching, especially ones as directly connected to music as Beavis and Butthead. It doesn't change how annoying they are, but I don't know, I'm trying to think of something, Jesus. I think a lot of the problems that people have with this album can be pinpointed in the track Screwed, which has a very repetitive riff that doesn't change at all for its entire runtime, and the vocal melody is kinda half-baked. That being said, I actually really like this song. Sure, the riff is pretty simple and repetitive, but so is every other grunge song, and it's also only 2.5 minutes, so it doesn't really stick around long enough to get annoying for me. I find it pretty meditative, with Cudi's delivery sounding relaxed, while slightly on the verge of having a mental breakdown. A couple tracks later, we have maybe the most infamous cut on the album, Adventures, which is the longest song, clocking in at over 6 minutes, though if you exclude the Beavis and Butthead sketch, it's actually only 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Nice. The song has a more laid-back groove that I think acts as a nice cooldown off of the previous track, Fade to Red, and there's barely any hook in sight, instead using its length to go off on drug-induced schizophrenic ramblings. It makes sense, as the song seems to be about going on a drug binge adventure, which he actually alluded to earlier on Confused. I also can't talk about the song without mentioning the infamous line, "No more chicken sandwiches. Yes, I'll pay for the damages." What? Okay, I can explain this. The McChicken is one of the cheapest items on the menu, and back when he was poor, that was all he could afford to eat. But now that he has money, he can buy better food, like a quarter pounder, which is like repairing the damage that eating McChickens all the time did to his body. That's what the lone genius annotation on this song says, and yeah, I can buy it. Honestly, I don't really see why this lyric is so infamous. I mean, on the surface, it seems like nonsense, but it's no.
Did the man who invented college go to college? Okay then. So gangsta, I'm so thug. Or nana.
Oh, the lyric I find more interesting is "Her vagina is moist and warm, I'll keep you safe, just hold my arm," as it talks about sex as this very calming and comforting thing that makes him relax and forget his problems, which I think is an underrated way of looking at it in music. The Nothing goes back to more lo-fi production and has this haunting, minimal backing instrumentation. In the intro, he asks for candy, which obviously means drugs, but it also implies that he's now in a more sober state, which explains why the production is now lo-fi, calling back to the first track. The verses are about him getting high again, but it's interesting to hear how he communicates the lows in between his drug binges, knowing that he's gonna regret getting high again, but it's the only way he can feel any semblance of a positive emotion. The vocal melody and guitar line are pretty solid on this song, though I could understand it getting a little too repetitive for some people, considering very little about the track changes throughout its 3.5-minute runtime, which you can say about a lot of songs here, so I don't know, it either bothers you or it doesn't. The high is written on the euphoric and abrasive Amen before Cudi calms down again on the acoustic ballad Handle with Care. Everything about the guitars and vocals on this track sound very Kurt Cobain inspired, and while I think the performance and overall mix sounds kind of demo-ish and leaves a bit to be desired, it's a decently written song at its core that's depressive vocals and skeletal instrumental are pretty fitting to the rest of the album. Hell, I think a lot of what he tries to do here is better executed on the teaser track Wedding Tux, which is also acoustic guitar driven, but is played in a way that gives the song more depth, and Cudi's vocals sound really smooth over it. Another teaser track, and generally better liked song on the album, is the gloriously titled Judgmental, which in a sea of tracks that sound like more effort was put into the raw expression than any structure or conclusion, is maybe the most complete sounding song. The guitars and drums are wild as hell, and sound like they could have actually turned up on a single from the 90s, especially with how they progress throughout the track. The real thing that brings it home though is Cudi's performance, as he reaches into the throatiest parts of his register, and it actually works out kind of perfectly. I love the lyrics here too, as he's just yelling at all of his haters and naysayers in a way that's reminiscent of old punk bands like Descendants or Suicidal Tendencies. Despite being catchier than most of the album, it's also more abrasive, which is made apparent by the fact that I can't even say the title without getting this video demonetized. It's kind of the centerpiece to the whole album, and maybe the best example of a punk song that Cudi ever made, alongside the next track, Seance Chaos, which is a straight-up hardcore-inspired interlude. From here, a lot of the tracks sound pretty similar to the ones that were on the album earlier, like how Angered Kid sounds like a slower version of Fade to Red, and Fairy Tale Remains sounds like a quieter version of Amen, although at the beginning his voice sounds weirdly like Eminem. There's still some highlights here though, like the title track, which is this Britpop inspired meditation on the album's themes, spelling out the punishments for living recklessly, yet having no regrets about it, and Red Sabbath, which is another laid-back slow burner with lo-fi vocals that play off of the electric guitar in a bittersweet way, with more lyrics about spiritual existentialism and...
What a long, strange trip out of the bend.
God damn it. My favorite song on the entire album is Fuchsia Butterflies, as it's probably the most well-paced and instrumentally dense track here, with various guitar sections playing off of a pretty solid bass line. It's not that complicated, as the lead guitar and vocals pretty much go by the same melody as the bass line, but all of the elements work really well, especially when the hook comes in. There's even a guitar solo that closes the track out, and while it pretty much just plays the main melody in an imperfect way, it's really fitting to the song's topic of drinking alone. And then Embers closes the album out really beautifully, singing from the perspective of Cudi's father right before he passed, over two guitar sections playing counter melodies that perfectly complement each other. So overall, Speedin' Bullet to Heaven is definitely a flawed album, yet I think it has some legitimately great songs on it, and even the tracks that don't feel super thought out offer a profoundly dark and intimate look into Cudi's psyche. The production is really raw and tasteful, considering it's a love letter to old grunge and punk bands, and while Cudi's vocals may be a little flat for some people, I can really feel the emotion in every word he says. I hope more people come around on this album in coming years, as it's grown to be one of my favorites of his. As always, if you enjoyed the video, you know the drill.
Uncrushable, 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 uncrushable.